Hey, y'all, I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Today is going to be a loaded show. We've had a lot of those as of late. Tuesdays, of course, mean the Marlowe's Tavern Insider Update. We'll talk to Jeff Sintel about a lot of recruiting stuff, good reporting from Jeff, and the aftermath of the Akiola Ogunbi decommitment. We'll kind of find out what's next, including those two big offensive linemen we talked a bit about yesterday, Cedric Von Prawn and Andrew Raym. There is seemingly new information out there on both those guys. We'll get Jeff on that. The aftermath of Kendall Milton, now that he's finished his official visits after being in Alabama last week. We'll do a lot of that kind of stuff. We haven't talked about Cory Wren at all either, the recent commit to UGA. There's one thing in particular that I really like about Cory Wren, and it is not his blazing speed. I will tell you what it is off the top, or near the top of the program today. But very first, kind of right out of the box today, Steve Spurrier has weighed in on Georgia-Florida. And yes, this will be, I guess, a little fun here, seemingly echoing some of what we heard of late, that maybe this game's history in Jacksonville may truly be a thing of the past, and maybe sometime in the future we may see this thing move to a home and home. We'll do a lot of that, including some things from Greg McGarity that I had not heard him say before. That's all coming up as DawgNation Daily begins right now.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
Steve Spurrier is wrong again. It seems like we've been saying that a lot over the last few years. Spurrier, a shadow of his former glorious self as of late, embarrassing the way that he ended his career as South Carolina coach in 2015, kind of a little bit of a silly venture into the, what is it called, the AAF that has now folded, claiming a championship for a season that never ended. It's not been a great run over the last few years, I would say, for Spurrier, but he has weighed in on the Georgia-Florida rivalry and its future in Jacksonville. And I think for some Georgia fans, this is kind of interesting because I think it does lead us to what Georgia actually thinks about this and the real truth of why maybe Georgia coach Kirby Smart is pushing for change in this. He may not get what he wants, more on that in a moment, but I think the reason why Kirby Smart is pushing for that change is still greatly misunderstood by a lot of people. Let me give you an example. As I said, Spurrier has weighed in on this. He was on the Paul Feinbaum show yesterday talking about, I guess, a lot of things. He's opening that restaurant. We kind of mocked him for that a bit yesterday on DawgNation Daily. But in discussing with Feinbaum on the show, the subject of Georgia, Florida, and Jacksonville has come up. It has come up a lot so far this offseason. Now, let me read you this quote from Spurrier. It's a little bit long, but it does set us up to go somewhere kind of interesting today. He says, I understand what Georgia's saying now. Back in 1990, when I got to Florida my first year, the Gators wanted to move the game. We had lost 15 out of the last 20, and they were telling me, Coach, we can't beat them there. Well, I said, wait a minute. We take a bus ride over there. It's the Gator Bowl. It's on Florida soil. Georgia has to fly down there. They have to travel a long way for fans. This is Steve Spurrier from the Feinbaum show yesterday. I said, this ought to be to our advantage. So we start turning it into an advantage. I guess we had a lot better team than they did in the early 90s, and the Gators were happy playing all those games there. But then Spurrier goes on to say on Feinbaum yesterday, but I can see Georgia's side of it. Tell the truth, I'd be very similar if the Gators were to go to the Mercedes-Benz Stadium Atlanta and play there every other year. It wouldn't make sense, but Jacksonville's a wonderful place. A lot of history there also in the old Gator Bowl. That's now a different name, but we hope it stays there. A lot of outlets did some reporting on this yesterday, 24/7 Sports, Saturday Down South, and others, about Steve Spurrier and the Paul Feinbaum show yesterday. Here's the part, though, where I think Spurrier is wrong, and he's been wrong about a lot in recent years. Georgia's issue with this game is not about the fact that Georgia once lost some games in Jacksonville. Now, to Spurrier's credit, when he was coaching there in the 90s, obviously Florida had plenty of success there against Georgia, and that's the kind of thing that Georgia fans, a history they don't like reliving. The 2000s were really good Georgia teams losing in that series. But in the discussion that's ongoing now, that stuff that happened in the distant past is not a factor into this whatsoever. Georgia's wish, or maybe more specifically Kirby Smart's wish, because frankly, for all of Georgia, it is not necessarily wish. Kirby Smart's wish for changing this game doesn't really have anything to do with anything that Steve Spurrier just cited there. Now, I do think it's really interesting that Spurrier, to the extent that he still represents Florida, is kind of an ambassador in this late stage of his kind of, I guess, sort of presence in the sport of college football, almost passively aggressively makes the move necessary for Georgia. When you've got Spurrier calling it a Florida home game, a lot of Georgia fans are going to say, well, if that's the way that he feels, then we ought to get out of there. Dan Mullen recently did the same thing. Remember when he was really referencing something other than Georgia, but it could be taken to mean in reference to Georgia as well, that anytime the Gators are playing a game in the state of Florida, we count that as a Florida home game. Well, that is going to push some Georgia fans to say, well, if that be the case, then Georgia ought not be playing every single year in Jacksonville. But ultimately, Kirby Smart's desire to move this game is not related to any of that kind of stuff whatsoever. It's not a home field advantage for Florida. It's not a larger crowd. It's not even really that much of a travel advantage in this modern time, in the way that you can kind of fly out of Athens and stay in a hotel before the game, which Georgia does before every single one of its games anyway. For Kirby Smart, this is more about recruiting. When I had a chance to talk to Georgia Athletic Director Greg McGarity last week, that came up. I asked him, hey, you hear from a lot of fans about this Georgia-Florida game in Jacksonville. Who wants it to stay there? Who wants it to go? I said to him, what is the balance of opinion on this right now? In McGarity's answer, he also talked about Kirby Smart's feelings, which are very different than what Spurrier just described them as. Here is McGarity on the Georgia fans who might want to move the game, and Kirby Smart, his feelings there as well.
It's usually, I think any decision of that nature is going to be 50-50 or 60-40 one way or another. There's been feedback from a lot of people on why the game should move, why the game should stay in Jacksonville. You know, it's been there since 1933, and I know Kirby's been very vocal about the importance in recruiting, and that's certainly an important element of it, but there are a lot of other elements that go into the decision. So we're waiting to have further discussions with the city of Jacksonville to where we can receive maybe more updated information on what we may be looking at down the road. What will we receive? We'll evaluate it, but you know, when we do receive that, we'll huddle with our peers at the University of Florida. We'll huddle internally with Kirby and the president and maybe some other staff members to really give it a deep dive into what's best for the University of Georgia, and I'm sure Georgia and Florida will be on the same page. We usually are on a lot of issues, but there's a lot of work to be done. But again, we're in Jacksonville through 2021, so it's not something that has to be done right this second.
So they're under contract for 2021, but you hear McGarity say there, for Kirby Smart, this is about recruiting and the absence of an opportunity to host some major recruits for a big rivalry game. As Kirby Smart himself has said in the past, our version of Alabama-LSU, that big conference game that everybody has circled, takes place in Jacksonville every year. It's essentially a wasted recruiting opportunity because we can't host recruits for what would be every other year in Athens, a gigantic football game. And then with McGarity last week, I went on to ask him, and for me, this was the first time I'd heard this said as explicitly as it was. I asked him, so when Kirby Smart references the recruiting, when Kirby Smart says, hey, it is a lost opportunity for recruiting, does that mean officially then that Kirby Smart wants this game moved? Is that his actual opinion? Is that the way you take his opinion? And McGarity said, well, let me let you hear what he said.
I think that's pretty much where Kirby stands because, you know, he's, you know him better than anybody. He is just a recruiting guru. So anytime something's done to take away from that effort, I think it feels like it affects our program. But there's so many other things going on in that game with that weekend that, you know, you've got to look at every aspect of it because a lot of people from Macon South and Jacksonville, Orlando, Tampa, we've got a lot of fans in North Florida that really love that game. So there are a lot of things to consider, but we'll all get together, and at the end of the day, whatever decision we make, it'll be our decision.
So I guess this leads you to a question, and I'm someone who has great reverence for all Georgia history, the cocktail party included. I've said before that if it's a vote among every stakeholder to Georgia football, I'd vote to keep the game in Jacksonville, and to a certain extent, I'd campaign for others to vote the same way. However, even someone like me who loves the cocktail party, it is fair to ask, if 50% of Georgia fans want to move the game, and if Kirby Smart wants to move the game, then how is the game going to survive in Jacksonville beyond 2021? Now, you say, well, they make so much more money that they're just going to have to keep doing it, even if half the fans don't want that, and even if Kirby Smart would prefer it be otherwise. Is that really true? Are we really in a stage now where Georgia would choose the additional money that the neutral site venue might provide over the wishes of Kirby Smart? I'm honestly not sure about that. I think that's a very interesting thing to think about and to kind of wonder behind the scenes just how much is Kirby Smart politicking to get his way on this. If we take McGarity at his word that Smart does want to move the game, then why would we not? how much behind the scenes is he really pushing on this? One more point kind of on this subject. I asked McGarity, well, you hear him say there that Georgia and Florida kind of work together on these kinds of things. I said, well, what if Georgia wanted to move on and Florida still wanted to keep the game in Jacksonville? You could just do this unilaterally, right? You don't need the cooperation from Florida on that. And in the midst of that answer, McGarity also said something else that I hadn't really considered before. Here's more from the Georgia athletic director.
I don't think that'll happen because we both think alike in this game. But who knows if it's their home game? Who knows where they could take it? If it's our home game, I know we'd like it here. There's been some talk of Atlanta. I'm not really sure that has much legs. If you're not going to play it in Jacksonville, then the games need to be on campus.
So I never really considered that before. There's been some talk of, well, maybe you do a rotation thing where it's Georgia, I should say it's Athens, it's Gainesville, and then it's Jacksonville, kind of a rotation. And some people even said, how about you add Atlanta as part of that rotation there as well? McGarity, who's obviously more involved in the logistics of all this, say, well, if you really made this happen, it'd be the team who gets the home game their choice of where to play it. So if Florida wanted to play a game in Jacksonville, apparently they could do that. If Georgia wanted to play a game in Jacksonville or Atlanta, they could do that. But the home game would belong to the team, and then they would decide where the game is played. That's a little bit of a logistical fact that I hadn't really thought about. He also kind of, as you hear there, kind of poo-poos the idea the game might be played at any point in time in Atlanta, which I certainly agree with. That, to me, is the least exciting solution to all of this. I mean, here's the overall bottom line. There's obviously a long time to go before any kind of ultimate decision is made. The contract, as McGarity said, runs through 2021. I'd like to see the cocktail party remain in Jacksonville. I like going to St. Simon's Island the week of that game and kind of soaking up some time at the beach. But I do think it's kind of fair to ask, can this game survive in this venue when seemingly so few people still want it there? My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Hello to you. Thanks for being with us live on video, 10 a.m., DawgNation Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, or on the radio at noon on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, and we love being on the radio in the Classic City each and every day. We are also available as a podcast wherever you find them, Apple, Google, the world-famous DawgNation.com. We're just really glad that you've checked in on DawgNation Daily here today. Now, speaking of the world-famous DawgNation.com. Hope you'll also go there as well and check out information about our DawgNation Days of Summer. The next big event is Thursday, August 1st at Brasstown Valley Resort and Spa. This is an unbelievable venue, and we've been there before, and we're going to host a huge event there on that Thursday night, August 1st. It kicks off for the public at 6 p.m. There's a VIP reception at 5 before the big event, and your way to get in on that VIP reception is go ahead and book your room right now. The tab to get into and get to a Brasstown is right there at DawgNation.com. Now, anybody that was at our last DawgNation Days of Summer event will tell you it was an unbelievable time. We had giveaways, we had gifts, we had fun times. I'm talking about one of the proudest moments for me as a part of DawgNation was the party we threw at our last DawgNation Days of Summer event, and I cannot wait for the next one at Brasstown Valley Resort and Spa. But it's not going to be as much fun unless you are there. So please go to DawgNation.com and find out more information about DawgNation being at Brasstown Valley Resort and Spa coming up on Thursday, August 1st. We'll get Jeff Sintel here in just a moment as a part of a Marlowe's Tavern Insider Update, looking at everything going on with UGA recruiting. But before we do that, I do want to right one wrong from yesterday. It's weird to think on a Monday in the middle of June, or kind of now moving towards late June, we'd have too much going on to fit it into one show, because for most people, they think there's kind of the downtime of college football. But around the Georgia football program, it would seem there is no downtime. There's always something going on, and in some weeks there's a whole lot more going on, some of it good, maybe some of it not quite so. Yesterday, one of the things that we really did not do was give due diligence to the commitment that Georgia got it on Friday. That's 3-star wide receiver Cory Wren from out of Louisiana, a blazing speedster of the highest order. And as I said to you, or at least I said to our video audience, if you're watching on Twitter, you see, or watching on video, you see the tweet from, as he likes to be called, Co-Savage, Cory Wren announcing his UGA commitment, and credit to him for wearing the red jersey in his commitment edit there. That's really good to see. But I said this to our video audience before the show started today. There is something I like about Wren that goes beyond just how fast he is, because anybody that talks about Wren is going to talk about the fact that he is, yes, a little undersized for a wide receiver, but my, oh my, boy, can he run. And that's everything that anyone's going to notice kind of first out of the gate about him. But beyond that, when DawgNation's Jeff Sintel, who we'll speak to in a moment, when he interviewed Wren, Wren said something about his desire for Georgia. At the time, it was, if I do go to Georgia. He said something about what he's expecting and hoping for from Cortez Hankton, what he's already appreciated about the Georgia wide receivers coach Hankton, that makes me really appreciate Wren. Here is Wren saying, listen, Hankton's always been really honest with me, and I expect to come to Georgia if I go there, which at the time he didn't know that he was going to do. If I go there, I think he's going to coach me up. You'll like this about Georgia's latest commit. Take a listen.
One thing Coach Hankton stood out was he didn't sugarcoat anything with me. He told me straight up, my film, it shows that I can run. But I want you to come here and play receiver for me. You're not showing me really any catching. So he told me you come here, the speed is there. I can't teach speed, but one thing I can teach you is your route running. Consistent catching. I really applaud that of him. Not sugarcoat nothing with me, not telling me. I don't like when people tell me, oh, you can come here and start right away. You could be the face of this program. I just don't feed into that. I'd rather come in knowing I have to work for something, knowing that I have to come in with a full-head of steam. That's really something that I feel like separates me from a lot of people is my work ethic. Mm-hmm. And I have a strong work ethic. I don't take no for an answer,
I mean, listen, I think humble and hungry is kind of an overused cliche when it comes to football, college football especially. But if you ever want to know what humble and hungry sounds like, that's it. Wren says, I've got speed that can't be coached. That's what Hankton's told him. But I can teach you how to be a route runner. I can teach you how to be a consistent catcher of the football. I can teach you how to do those kinds of things. And Wren says, I'm not coming here to be the face of the program. I'm coming here to be the workhorse of the program and work and learn and be the best football player I can be. Boy, I like that attitude from this young man. I think it'll serve him well at the University of Georgia. It's DawgNation Daily. We're glad to have you with us. Some really fun stuff coming up a little bit later on. But for now, let's get ready to talk to Jeff Sentell. And we'll get Jeff here coming up in just a minute, everybody. I wanted to wrap things up for our radio audience there. But we got Jeff coming up, a lot of recruiting stuff to get to with him. And it's going to be a lot of fun. I'll take a lot of your comments if you're watching on video today as well. That's going to be a good time. I know that we've been a little shorter on comments the last couple of days just because we've had so much going on. I've got a little bit of space today, so we may go a little longer at the end of the show than normal when it comes to getting your thoughts on kind of everything going on with the program there as well. There's also a lot I want to talk to you about with Jeff. I want to do more on the Wren stuff with him. Jeff had some really good stuff at the forum when it comes to the Georgia offensive line and kind of all that kind of stuff. So we'll do that and an update on running backs as well. In fact, Jeff Sentell is ready. So let's do a little Marlowe's Tavern Insider update with him right now.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Each and every week here on DawgNation Daily, we're lucky enough to get Jeff Sentell's twist on what's going on with UGA recruiting. But when you want chef-inspired food with a twist, let's face it, nobody would ever turn down a really good meal, and that's what Marlowe's Tavern provides because they take the extra care to do the kinds of things that only chefs would do, and they do it with that little extra flair that makes the meal memorable. If you want to impress somebody, that first date or that second date or, that 25th wedding anniversary, whatever special occasion, or just fun time hanging out with friends, my recommendation for all of those events are my friends at Marlowe's Tavern. And if you've heard me talk Marlowe's before and you say, I've actually never been there, so many of you have reached out to me on Twitter to say I have been there. But if you still haven't gone there, then become a Marlowe's Tavern insider, and you can find out the information you need to know. Text the word Marlowe's, Marlows, to 24242, and you can find out about special offers and big events happening at the tavern right there in your neighborhood. Marlowe's Tavern Insider Update. Without further ado, let's talk to Jeff Sentell here right now. Jeff, I will say good morning to you, and let me bring you in on the conversation we were just having about Cory Wren. The Wren commitment from Friday night kind of gets swallowed up by the Gunby decommitment, which we'll get to. The news with J.J. Holloman, which is obviously the kind of thing that Georgia fans were slapped in the face by a bit on Friday afternoon and kind of dominated the weekend. And, I just played an audio clip from your conversation with Wren where he talked about wanting to be coached up by Cortez Hankton and want to be taught the receiver position from him, maybe suggesting that not every school that's recruited him necessarily had that same attention to detail in terms of giving him the techniques and skills that he needed. I think in addition to Wren's blazing speed, I think that desire to be coached and that willingness to stay humble while he's learning, I think that serves Wren really well in college. And I thought It was an illuminating piece of audio from him. First of all, thanks for doing that kind of reporting for us. And does that mean as much to you as it does to me?
Well, I mean, let's face it, Brandon, and good morning, everybody. He is what it is. This is a Mecole Hardman-type role in the Georgia offense. Everybody remembers the Wildcat touchdown against Alabama in the national championship game, how he was able to stretch the field, how he was a weapon on punt returns. And Cory Wren, even though everyone labels him as his speed, and it is some certifiable, verifiable, blinding speed, he wants to be known as more than that. He wants to be known as a guy that goes in high points balls. He wants to be known as a guy that Kirby Smart says, I need a gunner on the punt team. He's going to be like, I'm your Huckleberry, let's go. And one of the things about Georgia that just stood out for him is Hankton, Cortez Hankton. Let's give some kudos to him, continuing to recruit well in the state of Louisiana. But he identified Wren as a guy that was a speed guy early, and then he went to go see him. And Wren's interpretation of the story is he thought Hankton felt that he was a shorter man, like 5'7", 5'6", 5'8". So when Hankton was able to eyeball him on an in-person spring evaluation, and he's about 5'9.5", about 175, some of the very same measurables as Mecole in high school, that's when things, like a lot of things in Cory Wren's world, accelerated and escalated very quickly. And for those that want to keep trading in the Mecole comparison, yeah, sure, there's not a lot of film of Cory Wren yet because he runs a high school veer offense. Not a lot of film of him yet catching a lot of those precise route tree layouts on his film, but he's running between the tackles. And let's all remember, Mecole Hardman was a wing T quarterback in high school who didn't even play in his first year on campus at Georgia at the receiver spot. So I think the development scale there with Cory Wren and Mecole Hardman will eventually look very favorable for that young man's career.
There are a couple follow-ups, too, that I think are important to bring up. First of all, the Hardman comparison works to the positive, just given the speed that Hardman showed in the Georgia uniform, but there's also a counterbalance to that because Hardman didn't play receiver in high school and spent his first year on campus in 2016 apprenticing a defensive back, you can make a case that Georgia fans never saw the best of Hardman as a wide receiver because he didn't start trying to play that position until 2017, and he was gone after the 2018 season. That's just kind of a fair addendum to that discussion, and one of the reasons why I think Wren's desire to be coached up by Hankton matters is when you are smaller than the typical SEC receiver, I think technique's even more important then. I think precision in your route running is even more important. The ability to, catch 1,000 balls after practice or whatever it takes to have, sure hands and consistently haul those things in during the game. Every single one of those fundamental things is infinitely more important when from just a regular size standpoint, you're less big than your typical counterpart. All those fundamental things matter more. So his desire to be coached up by Hankton, I think, will serve him well because that's going to be a prerequisite for him to succeed at the college level.
Yeah, those are all good takes, Brandon, but let's be fair to the discussion here. I think Wren is even a step faster than Mecole Hardman. Some of our resident physical science and training and kinesiology experts on the DawgNation forum broke down about 4.31 speed versus 4.4 speed or 10.41 versus a 10.67, which is, Mecole was probably around 10.7, 10.6 a lot in high school. And Cory Wren is a faster gentleman than Mecole timed in high school. And the other thing to think about there is, the game is adapting, Brandon, especially for like matchups. And we all saw how fast Jalen Waddle looked like last year for Alabama in the SEC championship game. When you think of a guy like Tyreek Hill, when you think of a guy like Brandon Cooks, there are lots of examples popping up all around college and pro football where these offenses want that fast, hummingbird on Red Bull type runner that will get around the corner and will run jet sweeps and will really confound the defense. And Cory Wren fits a specific set of skills. If this was a Taken sequel with Liam Nielsen, Cory Wren brings a specific set of skills to the Georgia offense. And there's only like 3 or 4 guys in the country. Maybe one of those guys is Matthew Bowling that can run like he can.
Doing a lot of fun recruiting talk with Jeff Sintel here as a part of our Marlowe's Tavern Insider Update. I'm going to warn you, Jeff, I got a lot to ask you about. We just did 7 minutes on Cory Wren. We're not exactly setting the blazing pace right now, but I do want to talk to you about a lot of things. And I guess the next name I want to discuss is the decommitment that Georgia also dealt with. It's Akil Ogunbi, the 4-star offensive lineman, who is instead going to go to Texas A&M now. And we kind of know the backstory here. We know that Ogunbi at one point in time been an Aggies commit. We know as of late he had been very vocal after committing to UGA about trying to get other players to join him at Georgia. So my question is, if we want to back the timeline up by even just as recently as a few days, what changed here with, as your reporting indicated at DawgNation.com, Ogunbi's concern about his mom's health, or really anything else that you can tell us about? Because, I mean, it was not that long ago that Ogunbi was like pushing anybody he could to join him at Georgia, and then in just a blink of an eye, he's on Twitter saying, I'm recruitment over, I'm going to Texas A&M, telling you at DawgNation.com. It's in reference to the health of his mother. How did all of this change so quickly?
Well, if you look, some folks out there have pointed out when they looked at Akiola's flip tweet or whatever, he never announced that he is flipping or decommitted from Georgia. He basically says, I'll be attending Texas A&M. And let's just simplify this, Brandon. For a lot of people, Georgia football is a, devoted, worthwhile, heartfelt, die-hard distraction from some of the walks of real life. But for these young men, it is their real life. This is their life. And simply here, Akiola had seen things in his life with his mother over the last couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, that led him to believe that she wasn't making the gains he wanted to after she suffered a stroke earlier this year. And he just felt about being away from her was no longer something he could risk. And, I think of situations like transfer portals come up with a family member close to home. But even when he was leaning towards Georgia, he used to tell me, he said, yes, my mother's recovering from a stroke, but the best thing I can do for my family is to take care of the next 3 years of my life and not and set everyone else up in my family for the rest of our lives. So he had a focus on that. But I think there were things going on there which gave him pause, which made him think maybe this is not the best thing to do. And everybody loves red and black. I know everybody that follows this program loves red and black. But simply put, if a young man starts putting football over serious family needs, then I think those priorities are out of whack. And hopefully everybody can look at this as saying, this is a young man who would have been great at Georgia, who was great for Georgia, but simply has to go another way with his college decision.
And now Georgia, I guess, you get a little bit more clarity about what was already going to be a log jam of offensive linemen. It's trying to fit into its 2020 class. One of those guys is Cedric Von Prawn, who it hopes to get, the center out of New Orleans. You had a kind of an interesting nugget that you dropped into the forum at forum.dawgnation.com, and my encouragement to everyone is to make sure they're looking for that free kind of mini burst of Sintel Intel there at the forum at forum.dawgnation.com. As I said before, it's a completely free message board to join and participate in. It is a ton of fun and a lot of stuff in there from Jeff Sintel. One of the things that you mentioned was the fact that the 4-star center from New Orleans, Cedric Von Prawn, was thought to be on campus this weekend and yet ended up not making that visit. We got a dead period here now, which I guess means that schools just can't initiate contact with the recruits themselves. So Von Prawn not making it in on a visit before the gun of a dead period. What does that mean for Georgia, if anything, Jeff?
Well, I think the dead period, let's properly define it. The same stuff can keep going on with contact and, messages and text messages and stuff like that. But you just can't host a recruit on campus. You can't entertain recruits on campus. You can't have face-to-face contact with recruits during this dead period. And this dead period is going to last for about another 3.5, 4 weeks. Von Prawn is a guy, you've seen some of his comments lately, and he's at the 5-star challenge this week in Atlanta. He is not at the opening this weekend in Texas. And the 5-star challenge is an event that's basically exclusive to Rivals.com media. One of the things that he has said, that he has maintained, is he still wants to make his decision as of now at an All-American game. Von Prawn has told me in the past, though, he would not be against making a silent commitment in order to maintain his spot in the class he wants to get to. You got to remember with Von Prawn, didn't make the trip right before the dead period, but he told me that he will very possibly make a trip to Georgia for that late July kind of reveal-ish one last surge for the 2020 class before everybody starts worrying about their high school football focus and their college football seasons and that Vanderbilt game for Georgia. Von Prawn, nation's number 3 center, big guy, has explosive upper body power in his blocks. If everybody can see that on his film. And with Akiola's decision, Mr. Von Prawn and Mr. Andrew Raym are front and center as the big remaining pieces for Georgia in the Great Wall of Georgia for Sam Pittman.
So let me follow up on Von Prawn with one thing. You know, I have noticed what seems to be a lot of potential Georgia targets, I shouldn't say all, but many of them accelerating the recruiting process. And my assumption's been, because Georgia's kind of the common denominator in each one of those situations, that Georgia's trying to put the pedal to the metal with the recruits that it's pushing for, and they are responding in kind to say, okay, I may make my decision much, much sooner than I initially thought that I would. Do you think that, and you mentioned that Von Prawn may make the silent commitment but not announce to an all-star game, do you think that Von Prawn likely also feels the same sense of, hey, we got to move kind of fast here because that's what Georgia wants to do one way or another? Do you get the sense that Van Prawn kind of feels the same way that some of these other recruits seemingly do on that subject?
I think the feeling is simple here, Brandon, with all this. If you don't know where you want to go, then you go through these burdens of talking to coaches and making all these trips. If you do know where you want to go, then it's becoming the norm that it makes more sense to just let the world know, just to get your recruiting over. Von Prawn is a young man that, listen, folks, I don't care where he's at with silent commitments or commitments. When it's time for him to be a Warren Easton High School road grader in New Orleans, Louisiana, that's what he's going to do. He's going to dedicate his entire bulk of his first semester of his senior year to that. He's not going to take official visits on weekends. He's not going to make a bunch of trips. He is going to be about chasing a championship once that football season gets well underway. The weekends are for him to have recovery, to look at film, to have meetings for the next opponent. There won't be a lot of recruiting with Cedric Von Prawn in the months of August the 1st to December the 1st. So if he feels a certain type of way, wants to lock it down and wants to make it silent, these are things that not only just getting the burden off of him, but he has a true focus towards winning a state championship for his high school team. And those are the things where I think Mr. Von Prawn, if he feels that certain type of way, would just want to move things off his radar and get this over with.
I think it's safe to say that 2 weekends ago, another offensive lineman that you mentioned a moment ago, the 4-star Andrew Raym out of Oklahoma, I think it's probably fair to describe him having a visit high coming off his time there at UGA. Well, some time has passed since then. He was at Michigan this past weekend. There is no doubt he's getting a strong pull from his in-state program there, the Sooners, just given the success they had with the offensive line a year ago. How much have things maybe kind of worn down maybe the wrong word, settled down maybe, I guess, after Raym was at Georgia? He seemed to love that and told you as much in his piece there at your piece at DawgNation.com. How have things changed since then after he was at Ann Arbor?
Well, Brandon, the thing that comes to my mind here is just maybe a card shark metaphor or a gambling metaphor. Because you mentioned visit high, but really it was a visit double down for Andrew Raym. He took an unofficial visit to Georgia in early June. That thing went well, and then he felt the need to come back a couple weeks later on his official visit. Then he decided to accelerate the timeline, as we spoke about. Took the official visit to Michigan, and he said likely that was going to be it. The online chatter, this is the phrase I do that gets Brandon drooling like one of Pavlov's dogs. The online chatter here is that it wasn't an extended family official visit for Andrew Raym over the weekend to Michigan. I don't think the entire extended family, mom and dad, went with him on that Michigan official visit. And I don't think he's going to make any other official visits either. So there's no return back to Oklahoma here for Andrew Raym. And I think I'm probably my best indication of the situation is grounded in what he told me a couple weeks ago. He said his decision could come in about a week to 2 weeks, 7 to 14 days, and that would put his timeline right at the end of the month.
It's a Marlowe's Tavern Insider Update with Jeff Sintel here on DawgNation Daily. And, Jeff, in the time we have remaining, I want to talk about some running backs. Kendall Milton was at Alabama last week. And, first of all, let me give you my sense of this, and you can tell me if you agree or disagree. It seems like of the 4 visits Milton took, 2 of those relatively noisy and 2 of those relatively quiet. I would say his visit to Georgia certainly had some noise and some reverberations, and not just because we're close to that here in the state of Georgia. I would say the Ohio State visit also had some noise and some talk coming out of it. For my money, the best I can tell, the LSU visit, the Alabama visit, both ended relatively quietly. Would you say that description of Milton's 4 visits is accurate?
Well, it's basically the timeline of his entire recruitment. Most in the industry thought it was really going to be Ohio State and Georgia as kind of the contenders, the main contenders in this decision. And then you see, there is a little bit of juice with LSU with Elias Ricks. That's his guy that they talked about playing for forever. That's the 5-star corner out of California who's been committed to LSU for quite some time. If you look at that backfield, remember, one of the indicators we've been told about Kendall Milton's recruitment is he is coming in to be a number 1 or a number 2. And I don't think that can be easily translated at LSU, given the fact that John Emery Jr. is there, Ty Davis is there. They have other backs in the program there as well. The path to being a clear number 1 or number 2 is not so evident there at LSU. Well, with Ohio State, they've got 2 backs that they've had on their radar for the longest time. It seems like some of the online chatter there for Brandon shows that Ohio State is starting to position themselves to maybe get in a position of strength with the other running back in the 2020 class they like a whole lot. He's another top 5, top 6 running back as well. Alabama was a visit where they still got guys like Najee Harris there. They just got Trey Sanders there. There was some, everybody saw Kendall Milton bowling with Trey Sanders and everybody else on social media. There was an interesting report, and I'll cite 24/7 Sports on this one, coming out of the Alabama visit, where his father stated, not naming names in this game here, but he felt to me that there was a 2-way tie for the best fit or the best official visits out of these 4. And again, that conjecture kind of extrapolates even further that there's probably an Ohio State pull here, and then there's a Georgia pull here. And did Alabama do enough? And where did LSU get into this thing?
Yeah, it should be fascinating to see with Kendall Milton here in the days to come. And I think, as I've said over and over again, if you're a Georgia fan, the only thing you can say is Georgia shot its best shot with Milton. Every indication I got was it was a very successful official visit. And I know you've had a chance to speak to both Chris and Kendall on this topic, and they had nothing but glowing things to say. This one's kind of out of their hands now to a certain extent. They have put forth their best pitch for the program, and it'll either be received or it won't be. But I don't think you can say that Georgia could have recruited Kendall Milton up to this point any differently than it has. Which brings me, Jeff, to another running back, and that's 5-star Zachary Evans out of Houston, Texas. And we talked about Evans on Friday because there had been like an Austin American Statesman report and some things like that about Evans taking an unofficial visit to Texas. Then, lo and behold, over the weekend, a photo shows up of him taking an unofficial visit to Texas A&M there as well. So what was a top 5 for Evans seemingly almost certainly has been expanded now. If you're watching on video, you see Evans there leaving Houston to go to a College Station to enjoy that visit there for a little bit. So at this point in time, it seems like this recruitment's expanded. The prediction I think most of us made, which were the Texas schools would get back involved, they pretty clearly are now. I sort of know less about this than I ever have before. I really don't even know what to say about this other than the fact that this one's getting more complicated the deeper we get into the summer as opposed to less. Any kind of comment or opinion you want to share on what looks to be a top 5 growing to a top 7? And I would say that the 2 Texas schools probably displace at least 2 of the schools in in Evans' stated top 5.
Yeah, I mean, there's a way to look at this, Brandon. Here's the template I'm going by for this one right here. I expect this to be a very contested recruitment. I expect it to look a lot like Trey Sanders did a year ago. And remember Trey Sanders, you had everything from brother at Florida, you had dogs in it, is Alabama in it, who else is getting in there with the nation's number 1 running back? I think with Zachary Evans, this is going to be a situation where I don't want to use the word anarchy. Could eventually happen, but listen, things can get really messy with the running back position, especially those guys up at the top with names like Oklahoma, Ohio State, Georgia, Alabama, LSU. Those schools are all in it for a guy like Zachary Evans and all these other guys, too. Pay quick attention to Jace McClellan, who is currently an Oklahoma commit, who took a recent official, and he's got great film, Brandon. I encourage everybody to check out that name, Jase McClellan, McClellan. The nation's number 5 back right now, rating ahead of names like Don Chaney Jr. and Marshawn Lloyd and Tank Bigsby. Well, he took an unofficial visit as an Oklahoma commitment to Alabama over the weekend. And that thing, if something happens with Oklahoma and their backs are no longer Jace McClellan and they're no longer Jace McClellan and Seth McGowan, let's say McClellan would choose an Alabama or choose some other school, then that would open up Zachary Evans to even strongly consider a school like Oklahoma again. And I listened to what you were doing there. You were thinking Oklahoma's full, Ohio State doesn't feel right. Those two schools are coming out. Texas and Texas A&M are coming in. But these dominoes can change a lot. Even with Bijan Robinson, that's the nation's number 4 back that Ohio State has always centered on Kendall Milton or Bijan Robinson out of Arizona as one of their 2 backs. And dominoes will start falling for the elite running backs. And outside, Brandon, of the guys that are already committed, like even a guy like, Seth McGowan, Marshawn Lloyd, some of those guys, I would say Kendall Milton's decision is probably the one that's most advanced compared to guys like Zachary Evans and Bijan Robinson, and Don Chaney's committed to Miami, Marshawn Lloyd's committed to USC, but I think Milton's decision feels more final, or something's coming down the track where there's not going to be a lot of up and down with that decision. That one seems stable once the decision is made. And the other guy you got to think about there, and among the nation's top 5 or 6 backs, is Clemson's DeMarcus Bowman. I mean, these running back stuff is going to be weird every year, Brandon, or highly unusual every year. But for the longest time, even with Zachary Evans, I was heard if he ever took a visit to Clemson, he would get an offer. But he wasn't going to take a visit to Clemson unless he got the Clemson offer. And otherwise, Zachary Evans' top 7, that rapidly expanding top 7, would continue to look a lot different. He's the nation's number 1 back, Brandon. He is so fast. The pro agility drill on him, he's lowered it down to 3.81. I'll get the chance to talk to him at the opening finals later this week. We'll get a good read on, or at least hear what Zachary Evans has to think about his decision. But that one right there, Brandon, if you're looking for a guy that's going to have a lot of endurance for the 2020 recruiting cycle, I think Zachary Evans is a name that's going to be on a lot of folks' minds at a lot of schools and a lot of message boards and daily podcasts for quite some time.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing. And by the way, as we get ready to say goodbye to you, I know I'm going to be on vacation next week, and so we won't have DawgNation Daily next week. But as you said, you do have some big stuff coming up. Would you mind just taking like 2 quick seconds and promoting some of what next week's going to look like for you in particular and DawgNation overall? Yeah, interesting. So we're going to have a neat story coming up really soon on the site about Carson Beck. Carson Beck's going to be at the Elite 11 in Texas. That will take place right before the opening finals. That's the national showcase for 160 or so of the nation's top players. They'll have combine testing. They'll have offensive lineman, defensive lineman drills and competition, and they'll have a true 7-on-7 tournament as well. Carson Beck's actually in the Elite 11, and the Elite 11 has 13 of the nation's top 25 quarterbacks there. That's where Carson can make a move up. I think they're currently, which to me seems like a grave injustice here, currently 7 quarterbacks in the country rated higher than Carson Beck for 2020. I think that has a lot to do with him not making a lot of the right combines or camps or showcase events this spring. But this will be a chance for Carson Beck to put his stamp on this class and say, I'm one of the best quarterbacks in the 2020 class, period, which I think he will do. And then I think there's only 18 to 19 key names for me to talk to over the weekend in Texas at the headquarters of the Dallas Cowboys over those days. I think January 27th through July the 3rd, there'll be a lot of recruiting national guy content coming up on DawgNation.com. And even in that forum intel thread,
over the next week or so.
Yeah, so just to be clear, Jeff will be at the opening next week in Frisco, Texas, and a lot of really interesting stuff coming out of that. So I won't be here with you, but y'all stay close to Jeff because he's going to have a bunch of stuff coming at DawgNation on all of that. Jeff, I know I kept you really long today. I really appreciate you spending so much time with us and talking about all this recruiting stuff. I'll see you tomorrow for Before the Hedges, and just really appreciate you being a part of the program.
All right, Brandon. Have yourself a good week, sir.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Good stuff with Jeff Sintel. There's a part of our Marlowe's Tavern Insider Update. Really, really fascinating. And I guess let me say one thing really quickly on Zachary Evans. I'm going to speak as a fan for a moment and not as a, I guess, for lack of a better phrase, like analyst or whatever. You know, I've told you before that I thought that it was a possibility that Georgia could get Evans and Milton in the same class. I just believe that's a possibility. If any school could pull that off, it would be Georgia because of how Georgia uses its running backs, the recent pipeline of success, Del McGee's recruiting ability. That's not a bridge too far for Georgia. And yet, if you're going to tell me that Evans would potentially have to consider Georgia with Kendall Milton maybe already in the fold or maybe rumored to be in the fold, we'll wait and find out what his ultimate decision is going to be. Georgia may lose that one too. But if we count Milton as a part of the Georgia class for a moment, Evans coming to Georgia with Milton while also getting a really, really strong pull from Texas or Texas A&M, given the fact that he's from Houston. Those two things in concert with each other, a part of a tandem at Georgia, saying no to two macro powers in his home state, that becomes pretty difficult. I'm not saying that Georgia can't do it, but just given the way that Evans seemingly has responded as of late to the push from Texas and Texas A&M, I guess that has me softening my stance on him just a little bit, so we shall see where all of that goes. Before we move on to do our SEC through here, I also want to tell you about my friends at Meriwether and Tharp. And listen, I know that divorce kind of thing, when you hear me even say that word, it almost kind of like shakes you out of your funk. Sometimes you may be just half listening to me, but the word divorce gets everybody perked up and everybody listening because it's a scary thing. You don't want it to happen to you, and if you're in the midst of dealing with it, you wish it was happening to somebody else. Let's just be frank and be honest here for a moment. You really need a friend on your side, and that's one of the things I think about when it comes to Meriwether and Tharp. I've hung out with these guys, I've talked to them, and their desire to help people is the first thing that kind of leaps off the page when you have a conversation with them. Even in a situation like this, they are looking to be an advocate and be on your side. They have free resources in a lot of ways, including a free consultation as well. I mean, my best advice to you, if you find yourself in this situation, go ahead and start the process of making yourself whole again by going to theatlantadivorceteam.com. That's the website, theatlantadivorceteam.com. That'll get you in touch with Meriwether and Tharp. And if you're in a tough situation, that is the way out. All right, so let me do some SEC through stuff here. And boy, a lot of old names, a lot of names we've talked about, in the past here on DawgNation Daily coming up here. I thought it was interesting to see that Hoover High School quarterback Robbie Ashford, who was a partner of George Pickens a year ago for is it the Bucks? Is Hoover the Bucks? For the Bucks there in suburban Birmingham. Ashford, who at one point in time was thought to be either Georgia or Auburn, well, he ends up going to Ole Miss. He announced that commitment yesterday. The Rebels, and I have said, by the way, if you're watching on video, you see there, and I guess Ashford's also going to play baseball there too. Remember, he is a really good baseball player to the point where that's a consideration in his football recruitment. You see him there in that kind of like sort of trifold 3 pictures on the side of that screen grab. 2 of those were him wearing a baseball uniform, and Ole Miss is kind of an expanding baseball program as of late. The powder blue uniforms they wore during the postseason those were something. I really, really like those. That's obviously not the main point of this story, but nonetheless, Ashford's going to go there and play both sports. But it's one of those moments where you got to give a little bit of credit for Ole Miss for actually recruiting the quarterback position pretty well as of late. Matt Corral, getting him from Florida, and at one point in time, some strong Georgia interest. That's a pretty good win for the Rebels. Following that up with a name that everybody knows, and John Rice Plumlee, one-time UGA commit, who I think would have liked to have been at UGA under different circumstances. He, I guess, is also a baseball guy. And then now Robbie Ashford kind of in the heels on that. So Ole Miss is apparently using that baseball pipeline to be pretty good for football there as well. And this doesn't matter at all, but I guess this helps the baseball program too, right? Because they occupy a full football scholarship, and they don't take anything away from, as many of you are aware, the very limited number of baseball scholarships. So if you can make that work, I bet Scott Strickland, the UGA baseball coach, is like, how about we do some of that kind of stuff over here? How about we get some of those baseball players to come over here and play? A few other names to consider here for a moment. Asa Martin who at one point in time was a 4-star running back, committed to Auburn, then transferred from Auburn to Miami, and now reportedly is back in the transfer portal again. And I hate this for these young men when they can't seemingly find a happy home to play college football. I think you're going to see a lot more of this, though, in the future. The more this sort of expanded transfer portal becomes kind of a thing. There's a Pareto's law in life, the 80-20 principle. Pretty much, 20% of the people do 80% of the stuff, typically speaking. I think we may see something similar to that in recruiting in the future, where when it comes to the transfer portal, we may see about like 20% of the players doing about 80% of the transferring when it's all said and done. A couple other things to get to here for a moment, and I'll try to make this kind of quick. A couple names we've also talked about here on DawgNation Daily before. Sons of famous fathers are in the news. 2021 quarterback out of Texas, Shedeur Sanders, the son of primetime Deion Sanders. He has recently been offered a scholarship by Tennessee, so the 2021 recruiting of quarterbacks starts to heat up. Georgia lost out on Brock Vandagriff this past week, seems to be focused on Caleb Williams right now. Shedeur Sanders gets the Tennessee offer, so it looks like he's kind of in the mix here in the SEC. Emmitt Smith's son, E.J. Smith, you remember the picture that we talked about a year or so ago of Emmitt Smith, his dad, the famous Gator, wearing the Georgia hat during a football game. E.J. Smith has come out with his finalists. Georgia is on that group. At this point in time, I don't believe Georgia and Smith have much of a relationship, but Georgia is a listed finalist along with Florida and a few others, so we'll see where that goes. I wouldn't expect it to be Georgia, but we'll see where Smith does end up choosing. And then two more stories I want to get to here really quickly. I know the other day I kind of said something semi-complimentary of Jimbo Fisher, the Texas A&M coach. Boy, a lot of y'all really did not like that take at all, because a lot of you apparently don't like Jimbo Fisher whatsoever. Well, if you don't like Jimbo Fisher, you will love Matt Hayes' piece at Bleacher Report. Now, Hayes is a guy we had on the show not too long ago, and Hayes did kind of a profile of the situation at Florida State right now. And let me tell you something. In this piece, athletic director, people associated with the program, they essentially trashed Jimbo for how he handled the end of his Florida State tenure. Now, I don't think there's any denying whatsoever that Jimbo had less than a full reserve of energy at the end of that run there. I think if Fisher were to speak on his own behalf, he would question the level of resources provided to the football program there at Florida State. They are not as all in on football seemingly these days as you would expect Florida State to be, especially those of us who were children in the 90s who grew up with that being such a big-time program. They're not really that anymore. It's really kind of weird to see. But basically, they blame everything on Fisher for why Florida State's in such a dire situation right now, which seems to me to be a little bit unfair because, they talk about Fisher missing on some quarterback recruits, but to my knowledge, since Fisher's gone, they haven't signed a quarterback, have they? So that seems a little difficult to pin all of that on Jimbo Fisher, but I bring this up simply because for those of you who don't like Fisher, and a lot of our audience seemingly doesn't, based on one of our conversations a couple weeks ago, you'll like Matt Hayes' piece at Bleacher Report really kind of going in on Fisher and painting him in kind of an ugly way. And then one more story to get to, and this is not about Georgia. We'll kind of wrap up our SEC through here, but I want to kind of mention this anyway from a Georgia perspective. The Charleston Post and Courier has done some reporting on the PED situation at Clemson, where a couple of their guys, as you know, were suspended in the postseason last year, and Clemson's had its ongoing investigation on this. But even in the midst of what you call like a freedom of information request, the sunshine laws in most states provide some sort of opportunity for this. Clemson's not going to release the findings on this, saying, "Hey, of all the guys we've ever tested, only 3 of them, came back with bad tests. But we're still not going to release the information because we're going to be protected by like the laws that protect secrecy for like medical information for players whatsoever." There's some dispute whether or not Clemson really has a leg to stand on that, but that's kind of the case they're arguing right now. However, here is the point I want to make from a Georgia standpoint, and I'll admit this kind of comes sort of strictly from a pro-Georgia point of view. I think a lot of Georgia fans have been kind of wondering for a while, is there a way to negatively recruit against Clemson, just given the success that Clemson has enjoyed in recruiting as of late? Is there a way to go back and kind of get after them? I sort of feel like if you were Kirby Smart in Georgia, you could kind of use this to your advantage because they're going to say, hey, we've tested all these people. Only 3 of them had bad tests. That just proves we don't have a problem with PEDs. But if you want to do like a ultimate kind of spin zone on something like this, couldn't you say, well, maybe that proves also that you weren't quite as fundamentally sound in terms of making sure it was going into the bodies of the players in your program? Couldn't you plant that in the seed of a parent to say, ooh, are you sure you want to go to Clemson? They don't even know what they're feeding their kids over there. They had guys miss the college football playoff because of a PED situation. They say it's not a problem, but do they really know what they're even putting in these guys' bodies? That's probably not a fair assessment of that situation, but in some respects, all is fair when it comes to recruiting. I wonder if somebody will try to use that against Clemson. By the way, speaking of floor, we mentioned them off the top of the program, 969 days. That's our Gator Hater Updater. We'll see you tomorrow right here on DawgNation Daily. And on video. Good to have all of you with us here today. Appreciate your interaction in our program, and we will do even more of that right now. As I said, I'm going to try to do kind of a good little pocket of comments here as part of our R.S. Andrews cool down. And listen, sitting here and doing this with you each and every day is one of the most fun things I get to do during the day. And if it was not for our friends at R.S. Andrews, I wouldn't be able to do this. They'd be making me do some other kind of work or do something else. I'd be busy right now. But because R.S. Andrews says we like the college football conversation, let's keep it going, I get to sit here and do that very thing right now. So please check them out online at rsandrews.com, especially if you get your air conditioning on the blink. R.S. Andrews is a great resource to help you with that. Their $99 Smiley tune-up will get your system back to factory fresh specs. When it comes to hot air on the outside, cool temps on the inside is a really, really good way to go. So check out R.S. Andrews online at rsandrews.com and find out why truly can be said that story after story, they deliver smiles. All right, on video, let me pull up the Facebook, and we will get going here. Give me just a second to get this up and running here. Your thoughts on kind of everything going on here today. And I guess I'm also curious to find out your take on the Georgia-Florida thing. I mean, I think that what's most interesting about that right now is the fact that we are getting to the point where there is just seemingly so much momentum on the side of change. I'm not necessarily in favor of it. You may be, may not. I believe that Greg McGarity, the Georgia athletic director, is probably somewhere close to correct when he says it's about 50-50 on both sides in terms of who wants to stay and who wants to go, who wants to keep it in Jacksonville, who wants to bring it on campus. So therefore, to say, hey, what do you favor, change or no change? That almost becomes an irrelevant question because when it's 50-50, how do you really sift through that kind of evenly split opinion? You're going to make half the people wrong no matter what you do. But when 50% of the people who want to change also have Kirby Smart on their side, boy, that almost becomes its own version of a supermajority. 50% of fans plus the one guy whose opinion matters more than any other. I mean, how do you fight against that momentum? And I guess the other question that becomes interesting is, as a Georgia fan, even if you love the cocktail party, if you love, St. Simon's, you love Jekyll Island, you love Amelia Island, you love all those places, if you love doing that kind of stuff, during that time of year, would you say, okay, I'll do without it if that's what Kirby Smart wants? Because that's ultimately what the $64,000 question is going to be, because I'm guessing there are a lot of people who say, at least for right now, Coach, I appreciate your opinion. I'm not ready to give up my condo just yet. I appreciate your opinion. I'm not ready to give up my chair on the beach in October just yet. But at some point in time, that's what this comes down to. Will Georgia fans give up something they love to satisfy the coach that they might love even more? Chris Hood says, bring it to Athens. And, boy, you're hearing a lot more of that lately. Scott Harris, thanks for the kind words. He says, great interview with Greg McGarity. I had a really good time doing that. One of the things that I've been able to do a lot more of the last year is kind of get out of this box. Listen, I love my studio here at DawgNation World Headquarters, but being in this room all the time does prohibit you from getting a chance to talk to the people who are actually making the news. Well, as of late, we've done that more. I was with Anthony Edwards not too long ago. I was with Greg McGarity last week. I'm getting a chance to be around those folks a little bit more, and I think that's a really fun thing to do, and I'm really glad to hear you enjoyed that. Alan McGovern says, right, BA, what's the best thing for UGA football? And, listen, in terms of, as Alan said, what the best thing is for the program, I think there's a reasonable debate to be had on that. Just because Kirby Smart wants to move the game to Athens, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is truly the overall best thing for the program. He has a good reason for wanting to do it. He's just factually correct when he says that Georgia loses out on an opportunity to host recruits for a big-time home game that, for the most part, the program doesn't get back. That, I think, is indisputable. It's factually correct. But that alone is not necessarily the trump card in the argument. Because, let's say you sat Greg McGarity on one side, and let's say you sat Kirby Smart on the other. It was like one of those old school, like, cable news debates. Now, McGarity and Smart wouldn't debate this way, but let's say you had one guy here, one guy there, and they're going to debate this like old school CNN Crossfire style or something like that. Smart would make his case, hey, I'm missing out on a chance to host recruits. But McGarity might make his case on behalf of, assuming this is his case, he might make his case on behalf of the constituents he's heard from who say, this tradition really matters. This tradition makes Georgia football bigger over time, which over the course of years enables you to win with recruits that you didn't get to host for that late October home game. That's seemingly a pretty convincing argument too. I mean, which of those two arguments is better is probably just a matter of opinion. I don't know that there is an answer to this that's cut and dry better than the other. It really comes down to, do you just aggressively give Kirby Smart what he wants, or do you say to a coach that's only going into his fourth year at UGA, you haven't been here quite long enough yet to make this big of a change to the Georgia program? And that's really what the question comes down to. Jason Glauzier says they want to keep the game there only because so many people bought a condo there. Now, I'm sure that there is some of that goes on. However, for those condos in that sort of beach area, as you know, that's not the only thing that, that's not the only thing that provides value to those beach communities there. Those real estate there, my understanding, is doing pretty well. And in some of those beach communities, I'm not quite so sure they're as pro cocktail parties as they used to be. The bar owners are. This is one of those things where the bar owners and the property owners might have slightly different opinions of how the cocktail party works out for their local community. So that's interesting. Scott Harris says, can we talk about kick and punt returners? He thinks that's a big void this season. And I do think it is a question worth asking, especially in the punt return game, because the overall kickoff game is probably not quite as significant for the sport as it used to be. One of those guys will almost certainly be Brian Herring because he's been in that role before. In terms of who that other guy that goes in there is, one of the things that we know that Kirby Smart has said is that Dominic Blaylock is going to get a long look at punt return. I would say that Karis Jackson's also a potential factor there too. And then your mind starts to wonder, what about the real speed demons on this Georgia roster as it's currently constructed? Does Demetrius Robertson get a look here because few would be faster? Does Tyson Campbell get a look here because few would be faster? From that group, sure-handed Blaylock, sure-handed, willing to take the physical load of Karis Jackson, just unbelievable world-class track star speed, which a Robertson or a Campbell might have. From that group, I think are some pretty interesting candidates. And I guess if there are names that I should have obviously included that I didn't, you can add those into the discussion there as well. Chris Branham does mention one. He says, how about James Cook as your kick and punt returner? If he proves he's got the hands, he is so fast and elusive. That's also a name probably worth adding to that discussion, especially when you talk about that top-end speed that makes him a real weapon. Kevin Lee says, BA, what are your thoughts on McGarity's response about Auburn and the lack of return from change to our schedule, i.e. playing Tennessee, Auburn, and Georgia Tech away the same years? I will admit to you, Kevin, that this continues to be a real source of confusion for me. This goes back to the interview that I conducted with McGarity that you can see on the DawgNation YouTube page. We'll probably put the whole thing up on Facebook at some point in time for those of you who haven't seen it yet, but it's on YouTube right now. I even included it in a story that I wrote at DawgNation.com from Sunday. Hope you'll check that out if you haven't gotten a chance to already. I will admit that this is a major source of confusion for me. I don't understand the swap with Auburn at all. And McGarity, to his credit, says, you may feel differently about that once the full schedule is announced. Maybe so, but unless it's drastically different than it is right now, I have a feeling I'm still going to have some reservations as to why this was a good move for Georgia. I mean, ultimately for me, and I know, listen, our buddy Connor Riley gives me a hard time because I won't let this thing go. Some of y'all give me a hard time because I won't let this thing go. Something about this, though, is just weird to me because Georgia has dominated this series, winning 11 of the last 14. I would suggest in a moment like that, when you have full control of something, you don't want to make any changes to it whatsoever, because why would you? Because you have the market share, you have the domination, and you don't favor changes to a market that you dominate. And so that is kind of, my overall feeling on the Georgia-Auburn thing. And the other part of this that's really confusing to me too is, and you heard McGarity say this in the interview from this past week, you've read this before at DawgNation.com, that Kirby and Josh Lee, who's the director of football operations, that they have vetted the schedule and they're okay with it. But when Kirby Smart was asked about this during the spring, he didn't say, yeah, man, that we wanted to do this. We've been trying to get this done too. He didn't say that at all. He said, you can't judge the schedule until you see it in its totality. That to me is less than a full endorsement of this. And then, the other part of all of this is I think that something that Kirby Smart said over a year ago has been misconstrued. Kirby Smart sought change to the Georgia-Auburn rivalry, and he spoke about this 2 springs with the SEC spring meetings. But if you listen to the full text of what Kirby Smart said then, the thing that he wanted change for was the fact that because Georgia went to Auburn in back-to-back years in 2012 and 2013, it now had a situation where, much like Auburn, it was playing late November road games against, in this case, Auburn and Georgia Tech, the same way that Auburn's playing at Georgia and at Alabama in those same years. Kirby Smart wanted Auburn to come to Georgia 2 consecutive years to kind of flip-flop that rotation back, and I don't think that he could have been more clear in that, and yet somehow some people just continue to misconstrue what he said then, which is that he wanted relief for the back-to-back road games. Well, the weirdest part about all of this is, by trading Auburn for November to October or late September, whatever it ends up being, the way the schedule is currently constituted, flip-flopping that with Tennessee, you're still in the same boat, because Georgia plays at Tennessee in the same years it plays at Auburn and at Georgia Tech. You're not getting any alleviation right there. So I know some of you are probably like, Kevin, why did you send BA down this rabbit hole? But for me, this is a really, really weird thing. And I appreciate McGarity being as forthcoming about it last week as he was. But admittedly, my questions aren't completely alleviated by this, but at the same time, in a wide-ranging interview, you don't want to stay stuck on the same subject for the entire time. McGarity was open and willing to answer any question on the subject, but those answers still leave me with more questions. And to McGarity's credit, he would say, you're just going to have to wait. He believes all of our questions will be lessened by the time the 2020 schedule is announced in full, and I guess we will see and then reserve judgment at that moment. Connor Riley comes on the show to probably tell me that I've talked way too long about this one subject.
So you bring up an interesting point about how Georgia has dominated, quote-unquote, this Auburn rivalry of late. Would you consider beating a team in 2 consecutive years by a score of 78-24, dominating them?
Ooh, I know where Connor's going with this, and so I will play along and say, yes, that is domination.
Okay, so if that's the case, and Georgia is clearly dominating Florida in Jacksonville, as they are, because they've beaten them 78-24 over the past 2 seasons, why would you try and mess with the mojo of that comes with, the Georgia-Florida rivalry, and potentially make that a home-and-home series where every other year it will admittedly probably be tougher to win on the road in Gainesville than it is in a neutral site in Jacksonville?
That is a unique argument in this discussion, and one that I really haven't heard articulated in quite that same way. That now that Georgia has a clear advantage over Florida, and it does even this upcoming year, you do make the rivalry now more difficult by giving them the game in Gainesville. Because I'm going to tell you right now, I think that Georgia on paper is way better than Florida, but if they were playing that game at Ben Hill Griffith Stadium here this season, that is a much tougher game. And all of a sudden, that kind of narrow point spread that some of the sports books have for Georgia-Florida, that would make a lot more sense if you're playing the game in the Swamp as opposed to the Gator Bowl. I think that makes a lot of sense. It's a pretty strong argument from Connor on that. If Kirby Smart were here, I think he'd say, as he said in the past, because our version of Alabama LSU takes place in a neutral site. That may not be the winning argument. That may not be the kind of thing that gets 80% of Georgia fans to agree with Kirby over Connor. But that is what Kirby Smart would say here. I really do truly believe, and this is not me trying to play both sides of the issue, I believe that both sides of this, not to bring politics into this, but part of me wants to start calling this Jackset. For those of you that follow global politics, the whole Great Britain wanted to leave the EU and they're calling it Brexit. Part of me wants to call this Jacksit, although that's probably bringing a little too much politics into the football conversation. Anyway, the point here is I think that both sides have a fairly convincing argument. My vote would be to stay. My vote would be to stay in Jacksonville. I just don't know that there's enough of a consensus on that side to keep it there, and that's what really becomes interesting. Is the movement occurring to end the cocktail party? If it is, that's kind of a big deal. And are arguments like Connor's enough to slow it down and keep it from happening? Because honestly, what he says right there makes a lot of sense to me. I'd like to see that message amplified. You ought to write about that. Have you written about that?
I've written plenty.
Have you written that specific thing?
That specific argument, no. I might do it tomorrow because I need content.
Well, listen, we all do. That specific argument, I think, is a very, very interesting case to be made. And if you're a Georgia fan who disagrees with that, I think it also adds to the discussion to to say why that doesn't matter much for you, carry much weight for you. I think it's a pretty interesting discussion all the way around.
And I would just add that. So we've seen how some of these negotiations have gone over the years with Georgia in terms of changing things around. Georgia didn't get a second home game against Auburn. They moved the Auburn game up at sort of the expense of Georgia's tradition. Georgia's going to be the one to initiate this change from Georgia-Florida, which, I don't know enough about what Florida fans think about this rivalry, but my best guess is that they're okay with it still remaining in Jacksonville for the most part.
Yeah, I honestly don't know fully how they all feel about this.
They're too busy talking about that famous goal line stand from a game they lost by 19 a year ago. If Georgia's going to be the one to initiate this game getting moved, I'd almost certainly be willing to bet that Florida's going to be the team that gets that first home game if and when this does go to a home-and-home series. Now, obviously, you can say, oh, well, Georgia will get the second one, but I do sort of think if you're, that's changing, going from a neutral site game to a road game.
So that's an interesting point. If Georgia initiated the switch and then didn't get the home game in odd-numbered years, which if you're saying that Florida gets the first home game, that would be, if the contract ends now, that'd be in 2022. That is what Georgia needs, right? Because they need the game in the way the schedule's currently constituted. You'd need the game in Athens in 2023 because that's the year you're at Tennessee, you're at Auburn, and to the extent that it even matters, you're at Georgia Tech.
Or what if Florida decides, no, we want you to have this home game first and give you that 2022 game, otherwise we're not doing it.
It would be – listen, I love them. It'd be the most Georgia thing in the world to get stuck with this thing in odd-numbered years, which is already
it's on the table. Like, you could see the vision where Florida's like, no, all right, if you want to move this game so desperately out of Jacksonville, we want it to be we want Florida, part of us agreeing to move this game out is we want the odd number year home games to be in Florida.
Yeah, I don't know enough about the typical Florida rotation. Now, their rotation's been screwed up as well because of the fact that they hosted LSU like 15 years in a row because of the weird deal.
To be fair, LSU hosted them 15 years in a row first.
So the whole Florida LSU thing is completely out of whack now. So I don't even really know what Florida's typical schedule rotation even looks like. It'd be very interesting to see what year, odd or even, would it benefit Florida to play the game in Gainesville. I'm assuming, as a pretty simple statement, they'd have 4 really big home games, right? They'd have Tennessee every other year, Florida State every other year, Georgia every other year, and LSU every other year. Those are the 4 games that matter for them that they play every year, right? And so they'd probably want, in a perfect world, they'd want 2 of them in one year and 2 of them in another.
I know they host Tennessee in odd number years. I believe now they visit LSU in odd number years. What was the third game you mentioned?
It'd be Florida State.
That I will have to look up.
Yeah, check that. See if you can do the math to see what year, odd or even, it'd benefit Florida to have Georgia in Gainesville.
In odd number years, that game is in Florida. So you would potentially think that even number years, they would want it. They'd want that Georgia game to theoretically be a home game. That way they get
which is what Georgia would also want. Correct. Georgia wants the even number.
But if you're Florida,
would
you want
this is so confusing.
if you're Florida, would you want Georgia to get what they want? I would say no.
That's very interesting. Tram Dickerson says if it's in the bins, both teams will get the feel of an SEC championship game, early feel for the environment. McGarry's statement on that I thought was really interesting because he was more clear about that than he could possibly been about anything else, saying there are no legs as he sees to playing the game in Atlanta for a reason that I guess I never quite thought about. Those of us who assumed that you could have some sort of rotation would assume that it would be just kind of a clean rotation, Georgia home game, Atlanta, Florida home game, Jacksonville, and on you'll go. But McGarry said no. You'd basically split up the games home and away, and then if it was your home game, you'd have a choice of where to play it. You could play it in Atlanta, you could play it in Jacksonville, you could play it in Sydney, Australia, I reckon. But it's your home game that you'd be giving over to go play the game in Atlanta, and therefore, if it ever changes, Georgia is not doing that. I think Georgia playing in Atlanta in anything other than a postseason game, other than random Bobby Dodd Stadium appearances. I think 15 years from now, I don't know that Georgia's playing a lot of neutral site games that are not postseason games in Atlanta as it stands. But it's kind of interesting to hear McGarry kind of explain how the logistics of this would work. If somebody goes back to Jacksonville, that'd either be Georgia or Florida were a change to be made. That'd be Georgia or Florida doing away with one of their home games to do that.
Tram, I love you. You're one of my favorite YouTube commenters. Having the Georgia-Florida game in Atlanta and Mercedes-Benz Stadium is the absolute worst idea that is even theoretically on the table.
And in fairness to Tram, this was started by Mark Richt.
Correct.
The first one to suggest that was Mark Richt, and I think Richt was just as wrong as Tram is.
Well, Mark Richt, he's never had a terrible idea. And, to his point about, potentially being a warm-up for the SEC East Championship game, why would you ever want to let Florida get anywhere close to even potentially sniffing what it might be like to play in an SEC championship?
Yeah, exactly.
It should be held in Jacksonville every year. That's how it should. One black coffee.
Let's see what else is going on up here on YouTube. Dapper Dan says, so Connor thinks they would give up what they want just to not give us what we want.
Absolutely.
That's certainly what the Florida LSU. I mean, we've seen what Florida looks like in these kind of negotiations in the past. And I know I'm just biased and Gator hater, blah, 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 blah. But I swear to you, in the negotiations between Florida and LSU that year of the hurricane, I think that Joe Oliva was in the right. And I know that it comes across like I just got every axe in the world to grind against Florida. But Florida, I believe, was trying to be sneaky during that thing. They had reasons, I think, for maybe wanting to postpone the game and then have it nice and easy back in Gainesville again. I think Oliva called them on their bluff, and I think the rest of the SEC just piled on Oliva for not being kind of a team player in those negotiations. He made the league look bad. And frankly, with all due respect to Greg Sankey, he is not the strong commissioner that Mike Slive was in terms of kind of keeping people kind of under his thumb on stuff like this. There are a lot of examples of this about SEC administrators going rogue. Look at some of the stuff that's happened with like Missouri and South Carolina women's basketball as an example of this. There's a lot of rogue behavior among SEC administrators in recent years, and when Oliva went rogue, the SEC didn't have a good response to it. But I believe that Oliva, even though he made a lot of other mistakes in his LSU tenure, my personal belief is that Oliva was trying to argue on behalf of his university, the university that employs him, the athletic association that employs him. And you know what? From that standpoint, how could you be mad at him? He said, we are going to play a home game on blah, blah, blah day, which was the day that Florida had proposed LSU coming back to Gainesville. I'm sorry, he was arguing on behalf of his best interest, and the world essentially wrote him off as a rational actor from that moment forward. But in this particular instance, I think Oliva was in the right. Now, we saw how Florida behaved during that. So you have a little bit of a template for how a potential Georgia-Florida negotiation might go, although it was interesting to hear McGarry say last week that behind the scenes, Georgia and Florida are actually pretty cooperative on issues like this. I wonder what would happen, though, if they decided that what was in the best interest was somehow, I guess, counterposed.
Can I tell you a story, BA?
By all means. I've told plenty of them.
So when I was 15, I just gotten my permit, and of course the first week I have it, I'm backing my car out, and I accidentally make a small dent in the door of my family's Ford Expedition, a massive car, a tank of a car.
Sure.
No one was around to see it except my brother, of course. I tell my brother, Billy, just don't say anything, don't make this a big deal.
Yeah.
It'll be fine. About a week or two passes, and my parents don't notice it, so I think I'm in the clear. But a week or two passes. My brother accidentally drops the vacuum cleaner down the stairs.
Wow.
Naturally, my parents are not happy at this development because the thing breaks open and there's dust everywhere, and it's not a good thing. My brother, in a way to, because he's obviously in hot water, but in a way to sort of shift the focus from him and sort of lessen his own punishment, tries to make my potential punishment even greater by telling my parents that I had dented the car and thus not told them about it.
Unbelievable.
Needless to say, I got yelled at a heck of a lot more than he did for the vacuum cleaner. And, to be fair, it was not a big dent. It's whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Point being, when you are with someone or close with someone and you're trying to, gain the upper hand or whatnot, sometimes taking a small loss is good for you if it means making things more difficult for a person you are going against and competing against.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that is part of the reason why I could certainly see Florida trying to make things more difficult for Georgia an odd number of years by potentially having them to go play at Florida, because that, those road games and not having those big marquee home games makes things A, more difficult for Georgia getting the SEC East championship, but B, making it sort of have those big game events to where you can probably try and attract recruits to Georgia.
I think Connor's bringing up a very interesting point, and I've never really considered this before, but I think it's probably true. I think it's more difficult to up in the momentum of a college football program that's ahead of you than it is to create your own momentum. Because when it comes to building up your program, winning with recruits, spending money on facilities, retaining quality coaches, those things, for the most part, are all in your control. I talked about Georgia versus Clemson during the regular show a moment ago, and I said, listen, if I'm Georgia, I use this PED thing, fair or not, as negative recruiting, because you got a negative recruit against Clemson somehow, some way. I'd probably just use this. And I think that speaks to the point that Connor's just kind of making. It may be a little thing, but if you've got any little thing to up in the momentum of a program that's ahead of you, that's actually more valuable than doing something good for yourself, because what other programs do is not fully in your control. Now, in the case of Georgia-Florida, they do play head-to-head, so they have a little bit to say in the stature of the other program. But in most cases, you don't get to play the teams head-to-head enough for that to really, truly matter. And I think that's interesting, that if you have the choice of doing something small to spite a rival who is in better position than you, or doing something small to benefit yourself, I reckon I'd choose to take something from someone else than to give myself something if that other program is ahead of me. I'd rather try to slow them down than try to speed myself up.
Yeah, then make up the ground. And 2023 is an important year for Georgia, because you know who their non-conference road game is that year?
It's Oklahoma.
It's Oklahoma.
Oh, jeez Louise.
So could you theoretically imagine having to go to Oklahoma in 2023, having to go to Tennessee in 2023, to Auburn in 2023, and to Florida in 2023?
Let me ask you another. That would not be a very good road situation. That's not very good at all. Which brings something else, and I promise we got more comments coming here, including Lee Bridges, who says dogs never trust a gator, and I think that's probably pretty good advice in all of this. So I asked McGarity about the non-conference scheduling that's gone on, the Oklahomas and things like that. And I said, how much of this is you and Kirby working together, and how much of this is Kirby just really pushing for this on his own? And McGarity was quick to give a lot of credit to Josh Lee, who is kind of director of football operations and kind of working out of that football office. Does that also put some of the responsibility on Lee for the fact that every single one of these games is a road game first and a home game second for Georgia, and in some cases well into the future, like the example of the Oklahoma thing? Now, ultimately, that may not matter all that much as long as all these games get played. But there is a way to say, well, what if, SEC expands to 9 conference games? What if the playoff expands to 8? What if conferences realign again? We've already seen, one example of that this week with UConn maybe essentially getting out of the football business and going back to the Big East for basketball.
As they should.
Which is probably the best decision they could have made.
Pitt and Syracuse do it next.
is there extra responsibility on a guy like Lee to negotiate well on the behalf of Georgia and is playing the other school first in their own stadium every single time? Is that an example of bad initial negotiations by Josh Lee?
I don't know about bad. I wonder if part of the negotiation process is, because I do think Georgia was the one who went out and initiated a lot of these. And I wonder if the precedent got set, because I believe the Texas was the first one announced, and Texas was like, all right, well, if you want to play us so badly, you'll come to our place first. And Georgia says, okay, that's fine. And then when they started making all these other deals, because there was sort of that precedent established, the other schools sort of piggybacked on and said, all right, we'll play you, but you have to come play us first. And I think Georgia in the long run didn't care about that. But, I do think that's why you see Oklahoma, and just because of the way the schedule is unfortunately chopped up, they have to wait 8 years for that return game.
I think that's probably true. Philip Jordan Wells says the wheels have fallen off the wagon today. David Josie says that pretty much so as well. So apparently people are not liking the schedule conversation, but I think that's pretty fascinating. So if y'all want to talk about something else, then by all means make a suggestion, and we shall do that. Dennis Wilson's talking about Felipe Franks over here. Yeah, I mean, listen, I think that when you look at how Jake Fromm compares to his other quarterbacks that he's going to be facing in the SEC this season, suddenly Fromm, as an experienced quarterback, especially against some of these quarterbacks who he's outperformed in recent years, now that you have a lot less experience at the wide receiver position and Georgia's essentially among the least experienced offensive teams in the country, suddenly the one spot where you do have a lot of experience with Jake Fromm, Connor, suddenly that matters a whole lot more.
Right, and the depth situation behind him was already questionable coming into the season, and given that we still don't know what Dwan Mathis' status is going to be for this upcoming season, it's arguably even more important, because if Fromm goes down, Stetson Bennett might literally be the only healthy quarterback that could potentially play this year. So I think there's a lot on Jake Fromm's plate, both from what's behind him standpoint and sort of what he sort of has to want to accomplish. I saw there was some online chatter to say a couple guys at 247 brought up what Jake Fromm's legacy might be. I think it's right now it's a little similar to what Aaron Murray was. Maybe he's a little bit more appreciated than what Murray was during his own time, because as someone who was around Georgia that time and sort of certainly engaging in the fan perspective, I think Murray was someone who was not very well liked or well thought of by the Georgia fan base at large until really his senior season, where we really appreciate all that he did for the Georgia program, and then unfortunately on senior night he tears his ACL in his final game against Kentucky, and it was sort of like we had this great quarterback and we didn't really appreciate him for what he was. And I think Fromm, a lot is going to ride on this year, because I believe that he's going to be a first-round draft pick next year, and if that's the case, you have to go pro. And if he doesn't leave here with a win over Alabama, or doesn't leave here with a win over an SEC championship, I think that's going to bug a lot of people who root for this team for a long time.
So I was listening to the radio in Atlanta the other day. That's the city where I live, and they're talking about Matt Ryan, the Falcons quarterback. And the debate, the discussion came up of, is Ryan a Hall of Famer? Some Falcons fans think he is. Some people outside Atlanta think that he's not. Connor, you heard him weigh in right there. And the point that I was kind of thinking about in my mind as I was driving around and listening to this discussion is that really very few players are Hall of Famers while they're playing. Some are, but those are the best. For the most part, a Hall of Fame career is something that you put together and then look back on and see, wow, that's a Hall of Famer. There aren't that many people. At the quarterback position in the NFL right now, we have a few, but nonetheless, there aren't that many people that are surefire Hall of Famers while they still have several years of play left in front of them. I think Matt Ryan's an example of that. Is Matt Ryan a Hall of Famer yet? We don't know, because his career's not done. If his career ended today, I would say he's probably not. But could he still become one? I think he's got enough years left where that could happen. In a weird way, I think the same thing's kind of true for Jake Fromm. Connor asked the question, is Jake Fromm an all-time great quarterback? Honestly, I don't even know what the status for getting the College Football Hall of Fame even is. I'm not going to use that. But we all know what an all-time great quarterback is. I think Fromm is like most quarterbacks or most big-time college football players, that we don't know yet if he is or if he isn't, because his junior season, one way or another, is going to tell the lion's share of his story. With Herschel Walker, things were different. Herschel Walker was like halfway through his freshman season, and you could probably look around and said, man, this is one of the greatest college football players of all time, and Georgia fans are in the midst of this. But most players are not that good. Fromm is either a really good quarterback that'll, one day be a huge fan favorite that everybody has fond memories of, or he's an all-time great quarterback that you have to think about building a statue for, something like that. Which one of those two things is true? It depends on what happens this junior season, possibly a senior season, but one way or another, Fromm's legacy is largely going to be determined by this junior season, I believe. And which side of that does he end up on? I think it's way, way too early to tell. Fromm's best has been exceptional. Fromm's less than best has been, at times for some fans, probably a little disappointing. But he stands on deck with a chance of becoming an all-time great quarterback in the next 15 games, which I hope Georgia plays in. The next 15 games, one way or another, will help determine that, which makes Fromm a little bit similar to a lot of other people as well, because I'll give you a counterexample to this. Tua Tagovailoa last year, people would have said about halfway through the season, wow, we're watching one of the all-time great college quarterbacks. He's already won a national championship. He's going to win the Heisman Trophy, and it seems destined that he's going to just do great things for the next 2 years. As it stands right now, I don't think people are as sure of that as they once were. Now, he may prove everybody initially correct with how he performs in his also junior season. But sometimes these opinions that we think we have, the more data becomes available, the more we kind of change that opinion. For Tua, that opinion may have been changed a little bit for the negative. For Fromm, he may add to his legacy with this season, but this is still yet to be determined. And I'd say the same thing is also potentially true for Trevor Lawrence as well.
If Jake Fromm wins a national championship this year, which I think they still do, even after the Jeremiah Holloman loss, Jake Fromm's the greatest quarterback to ever play for Georgia football. Right?
I think it's
hands down.
I think it's undisputed,
yeah.
Undisputed if that were to happen, because not just because he'd have the hardware, but because of the level of play that would likely be required to get him to that. The kind of play at the quarterback position that's taken to win national championships recently has just been off the charts. And so Fromm would likely have to be, even with a good offensive line and a really good running game, he'd have to be something close to that, which would put him in some real rarefied air. I think when you look at best quarterbacks at Georgia history, I think you look at a couple different categories. There's the statistical category that for the most part is dominated by Aaron Murray with Eric Zier right behind. There's the prestige category that for the most part is dominated by Buck Belue because he won a national championship, with David Green right behind because Green broke the drought in terms of winning the SEC. There's the NFL draft pick category, which Matthew Stafford for the most part dominates because he was the number 1 overall pick. There is a chance that Fromm has all those categories to his own.
Yep.
And that's kind of what he's playing for with his final legacy. Matt Rugavini kind of weighs in and echoes the same sentiment, saying greatest or most talented. I would argue that Stafford still has the most best raw qualities of any Georgia quarterback. Mental mistakes, however. And I think that's kind of the thing. And I think that, listen, I enjoy watching Stafford play. I think he's really, really fun to watch. But I think the same kind of perplexed feelings that some Georgia fans had about Stafford, I think that Lions fans have also had those about him over the course of these last years when he's been healthy. He's pretty clearly a franchise quarterback from the standpoint of Detroit's not looking to replace him. But I'm sure there are plenty of Lions fans who spend a lot of Monday morning saying, why couldn't things be just a little bit different? So that's probably the overall story when it comes to Stafford just a bit.
G. Grace brings up Tua, defends him as he's want to do. He says Tua's going to win the Heisman this year. I don't think Tua's going to win the Heisman this year. I don't know what, because he put up statistically great numbers a season ago and he still didn't. And I think with him the big question is, as great as Tua was, he struggled against Georgia full out.
Mm-hmm.
And I've said over and over and over again, health is a skill, and Tua proved last year that that's not necessarily a skill he possesses right now.
Yeah.
He did not play well against Clemson. And I think with Tua, the questions of, can he do it in the big games? And the big games are usually happen after that Heisman Trophy is handed out. I feel pretty comfortable saying I really don't think he's going to win the Heisman Trophy this year.
Yeah, plus, for the most part, isn't it fair to say that Heisman Trophy winners have kind of come out of nowhere?
Mm-hmm. With the exception of Marcus Mariota, that's been the case.
Kyler Murray would not have been. He was the Oklahoma quarterback, would not have been predicted to win the award. Go back more than 5 years ago now. A Johnny Manziel kind of comes out of nowhere. A Jameis Winston kind of comes out of nowhere. Lamar Jackson kind of comes out of nowhere. There is a really good chance that if we mentioned 100 names, the Heisman Trophy winner might be the 101st name, the guy that doesn't get mentioned in that conversation. So that's at least part of that. Anybody else got anything they want to say before we get ready to go here? Elite Georgia Boy says the 2018 UGA team would cream. I think he's saying the 2008 Georgia team that was the preseason number one. And I do believe, listen, I'm not going to get into saying anything bad about the 2008 team, but I will vouch for the most recent edition of Georgia football that Georgia would have been a point spread favorite over every team in the country last year but two. They would have been at least a touchdown favorite over the two teams. And this is not coming from me. This is coming from people who've crunched this number. They'd be at least a touchdown favorite over the two teams that made the playoff ahead of UGA. I'm talking about Notre Dame and Oklahoma for a minute. That doesn't mean that Georgia would have won those games. It doesn't mean that Georgia should have been in the playoff or should have won the national championship. But Georgia on paper had favorable stats to every team in the country minus two. The 2008 team was not really close to that. And I would be curious to see how many teams that really was true for that. You know, people want to say, well, how much has Kirby Smart really done in 3 years, and how much of a letdown was the 2018 team? In terms of how it finished the season, there's no doubt it finished south of where Georgia fans wanted to be. But in terms of the numbers below the numbers, I don't think that Georgia has ever been as dominant for two consecutive seasons. And by the way, that includes the early 80s, I think. I don't think that Georgia's ever been as dominant for two consecutive seasons compared to the rest of college football than what it was in 2017, 2018. What does that mean for 2019? It's still yet to be determined. But Georgia's sort of spot in the pecking order to compare to everybody else, the gap between Georgia and the rest of the country's never been greater minus just two teams.
Right, because you certainly know more about those early 1980s teams, but if I remember correctly, they played a ton of close games over that time span, whereas, Georgia hasn't had an SEC East game decided, or an SEC East game decided by two touchdowns in the last 2 years. And other than losing on the road against Auburn and LSU, they've pretty much done really well against the rest of the SEC.
Cliff Hancock asked an interesting question. We'll finish with that in a moment. And, a lot of those close wins that those other Georgia teams garnered, the early Rick years, the early 80s Dooley's years, are some of my fondest memories when it comes to Georgia football. And yet, the absence of those kinds of close games through the last 2 years of Kirby Smart, I think, is something that really speaks to what Smart's building here at Georgia right now. All right, the last comment of the day belongs to, who did I say gave this to us a minute ago? I forget. Where did he go? Cliff Hancock, who says, any commitments on the schedule soon? One way or another, we are heading towards an interesting week of announcements. You got Keely Ringo dropping the top 5 on June 27th. What is today's date?
Today is the 25th.
So we're 2 days away then from Ringo on the 27th. You've got the opening next week, and Jeff will be there. And a lot of these guys that don't speak a ton will be speaking at that event. So I don't know that you get commitments coming out of it. You may, and if they do, I'll be on vacation. You may get some commits coming out of that. But we will hear some interesting things said publicly by these guys then. So I don't know next commitment to fall. You're probably on guard for some of this, some of these guys that have kind of been kind of flirting here for a while. You may be on guard for a little bit of them. I can't tell you when news like that will drop, to the good or the bad for Georgia. But I would say that between now and the end of next week, we have a lot of recruiting news one way or another. Georgia's going to be a finalist for Ringo. We already know that. Who are the other schools that get included in there? What does Ringo say to go along with that? That'll be interesting. Now that Kendall Milton's official visits are over, that's interesting. Does Zachary Evans give us more details about, his feelings about these Texas schools? That's going to get pretty interesting. These offensive linemen, now that Akiola Gunby's out of the mix, we're going to hear more from them, I would guess. So, we're going to hear a lot over the next 10 days. Now, is it going to be a commitment? I don't know. But it's going to be a pretty newsy next few days, I would assume.
Just to fill in some of the blanks here, Andrew, as Jeff mentioned earlier on the show today, Andrew Raym is expected to announce his decision at some point within the next week. Keely Ringo announcing on Thursday. June 27th is an important day in Georgia football history commits. That is when Zamir White, the number one player at his position, committed, and Keely Ringo is aware of that.
Yeah, that's right. We had the Twitter exchange on that. That's right.
Don't be surprised if it's something a little bit more than a top whatever.
So Joel Moody says, I don't have a very good poker face because I know a commitment's coming. That's what he says. Listen, I've told you this before. I purposefully designed for myself a scenario where I would never come on this show and have information that I don't tell you. There are plenty of conversations with, someone like Jeff Santel that I just simply avoid having because I don't want to. If he knows, and I don't know what he does and what he doesn't, but if he knows, I don't want to know if it's not for public consumption, because I would never sit behind this microphone, looking at this camera or podcast, radio, whatever it is, and keep something from you. That's just not the way I do the show. I do this show telling you all everything that I do know. There are plenty of times when it comes to some of these recruits as of late, I have said, here's what I think I know, and given you my opinion, but it's just my opinion. But one thing you don't ever have to worry about with me is me sitting on a piece of news that I'm not telling to each of you, because that is not how I would do that. Travis Baltziger says Keely Ringo is a dog. Would that be my prediction? It would be my prediction. Absolutely, that would be my prediction. But I don't know when it's coming. Joel Moody says, Jeff knows, so you know too, BA. It ain't like he isn't telling you. Listen, you can ask anybody about this. I'm not one of these guys that goes on with him and says, all right, Jeff, give me the real secret. Give me what's really coming. I will.
What's the scoop?
Yeah, I will sometimes tell him what I think it probably is, and Jeff will just kind of roll his eyes and move on. But y'all, I've designed this show a very specific way. I want to be in the foxhole with each of you. I don't want to be on an ivory tower looking down on you, deciding which information I'm going to give you and which information I'm going to withhold. That is not the kind of thing that I would ever want to do. That is not my MO at all. All right. Anybody else before we go? Boy, it's getting late for sure. All right, y'all have a great day. Really good stuff. Speaking of Jeff, we'll see him tomorrow before the Hedge is presented by Kroger. That's going to be a ton of fun. I will see all of you back here tomorrow morning at 10. And as I said, I do have vacation coming up next week, so I will be gone and looking forward to being with you then the following Monday after that. And we'll kind of roll all the way through this entire wild ride through the playoff and signing day and everything else. It's going to be something. We'll buckle up for it and get ready to go, and we'll see where all of this ends. Y'all have a good day. We'll look forward to talking to you next time. Huge thanks, by the way, to R.S. Andrews for making this all possible. R.S. Andrews and R.S. Andrews Cool Down. Check them out online at rsandrews.com. Get involved with that $99 Smiley tune-up, and they will get you well taken care of. Let me also thank my friends at the AJC here for a moment, too. Lot to keep up with when it comes to sports news. Sometimes you want to stay in the know, though, about other things that are happening, especially this time of year where you have a lot of wild kind of weather stuff. Big storm came up out of nowhere last night. That's one of the reasons why you want to check in with the AJC throughout the day. AJC.com. It's the place to get Atlanta news now. I mentioned the Falcons before. Great way to stay up to date on what's happening with them. Aftermath of the Hawks and the NBA draft. A lot of presidential candidates coming through Georgia. No matter your political persuasion, you can keep up with that at AJC.com as well. It's Atlanta news now at the AJC at AJC.com. Hope you'll check that out. We'll see you tomorrow after the show for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down once again. And, of course, tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. for DawgNation Daily Live. You have a great day. I'll look forward to speaking to you then.